Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm sorry I'm a couple minutes late. I know that if you gave Anish a little bit more time to filibuster, he's already a senator in waiting. There's no time he couldn't fill. I also, this is exciting for me to get a chance to talk to entrepreneurs. Maybe we could turn back. Okay, here. Hold on a second. I'm getting a lot of feedback. That's better. Talk to entrepreneurs. I think it's great that UVA is doing this. One of the things I tried to do as governor as well was really dig in at all of our universities in terms of their patent offices, in terms of how we move the intellectual property from our great universities out of the laboratory into the marketplace. I think we made some progress. I think there's more to be done. But I want to turn this as quickly as possible into a conversation. I want to touch on, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly about what's happening here in Washington. A lot of bad and ugly, so I'll try to focus for a bit on the front end on the good. And why, again, I think what your conversation today with venture capitalists, with entrepreneurs, is a great place and a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Data has recently shown, I don't know if you've had a chance yet to share with the group, the Kauffman Foundation data, that shows over the last 20 years, 80% of all the new jobs created in America are not being created by Fortune 500 companies. They're even classically not being created by small businesses, the way that we politicians always love to talk about small business, the barbershop, the hardware store. They're not adding that many jobs. The number of where the 80% of the new jobs are coming from are startups and the kind of creative, destructive capitalism that startups always create. Now, a lot of that is in the tech field. As many in the audience know, I was in the telecom field and then the IT field. But it's not just tech per se. Two of the fastest growing companies in the last 5 or 6 years have been Lululemon on the kind of women's yoga clothing, and Under Armour right up the road in the Baltimore region. So it's across the field that startup companies are taking place, and they are growing jobs. And as mentioned earlier, as a venture capitalist, one of the things I always looked at teams that I invest in is not only the quality of the business plan, but the quality of the management team. And I absolutely believe that backing a management team that had had a failure or two under their belt was a good indication of a team that hopefully had learned. Nothing wrong at all with failure, as long as you can pick yourself up from that failure and learn. What maybe all in the audience don't know is my first two businesses were miserable failures. One, it took me 6 weeks to fail, and I lost all my capital invested. The second one was 6 months to fail. And before I got into the wireless industry, I spent about 6 months living out of my car, sleeping on my friends' couches. Still recall to this day, as back in 1982, I would go around and fall into this third industry, the cellular telephone business. And all of my law school classmates, I'd gone to Harvard for law school, who were all, starting to prosper at big law firms. They all told me in 1982, Warner, go get a real job. Nobody's going to want a car phone. They're still practicing law, and it ended up being the right choice and venture. Now, over the last 20 years as well, though, we've seen, through the 90s, an enormous upsurge. It really was the heyday for IT, for telecom, for venture capital firms, maybe even to the excessive point. When we look back now and see some of the companies who had market caps in excess of $1 billion with no revenues, I sometimes go back and scratch my head and look at the portfolio I had in the late 90s and wonder, how did I ever think, even with the bulge bracket firms in New York saying these firms were all worth billions of dollars, how did I ever think that these business models were as potentially prosperous as they appeared to be? We saw the 90s with tremendous growth of high-tech firms, startup firms, and then starting at the end of the 90s, after the tech bubble burst, we've really seen a dramatic shrinking. We saw a lot of the better venture capital funds kind of graduate up the food chain, become larger and larger, less and less willing to do early stage or seed stage funding. We saw a lot of the angel networks disappear from around the marketplace. We saw, frankly, the whole move towards entrepreneurship and startup companies dramatically decline. Matter of fact, I would argue in the first decade of the 21st century, with the exceptions, and big exceptions, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters, mostly all in relatively low capital areas of social media, that, as opposed to the first decade of the 21st century being entrepreneurial, most of the talent in the country moved from starting up companies to creating financial instruments. That's where all the innovation was taking place. Unfortunately, that financial innovation, which was supposed to be about better pricing of risk, ended up creating a financial house of cards that almost brought the whole financial system crumbling to a halt. And in many ways, post-recession, we have been trying to pick up the pieces from that almost excessive innovation, but not excessive innovation in terms of areas that created things, but excessive innovation in the financial markets. And that has resulted in financial reform. It's resulted in the requirement to put forward the kind of, basically, the multiple $1 trillion or multiple billions of dollars we've done in the stimulus and some of those actions. Fast forward to today and some of the actions that I'm working on right now, and how can we again, get back, maybe not to the heydays of the 90s, but make this second decade of the 21st century a lot more, again, the era of the entrepreneur. One of the things that we found in this first decade of the 20th century, in the excesses of the 90s, as always, Congress has a tendency to overreact. We saw in the cases of Enron and certain other circumstances where there were companies that went public that didn't have appropriate financial controls in place, didn't have in place appropriate oversight. So in an effort to better regulate, and in some cases I would believe over-regulate, we created Sarbanes-Oxley, which dramatically decreased the avenue for exits for startup companies to go through the going public route. We've all seen the data in terms of the enormous dearth of companies going public during the first decade. A lot of that was due to the fact of transaction costs that would add $3 to $5 million in additional accounting and other oversight requirements for a company to go public. Consequently, without the ability to go public, more and more companies were then, their only exit avenue was to sell off to larger companies. And unfortunately, I would argue that history has been kind of rift with, a lot of great companies where good ideas go to die is when sometimes they're bought by larger companies. Isn't always the case, but we can point in the last decade to a lot more companies that got swallowed up by companies that then were never to be heard from again, where if they'd had the option and ability to go public, we might have seen more growth and more job generation. At the same time, because of the dearth of angel networks and because of the fact that the better venture capital firms didn't do as early stage funding, we were finding less and less access to capital. Obviously, the traditional banking sources have cut back, that they had disappeared. And so we were stymied with two or three problems. One, how do we decrease, not get rid of regulatory oversight, but decrease the amount of regulatory oversight and hurdles you have to jump through to go public? How can we reform Sarbanes-Oxley? And then secondly, can we utilize the power of the internet as a way for early stage companies in a limited fashion to access capital? Just as we created a trusted network of exchanges and trades through eBay and some of the subsidiary organizations that followed on that, can we use the internet as a source of fundraising, again, particularly for small ideas? Again, almost democratization of capital for entrepreneurs. I'm happy to report that while not perfect by any means, we finally had an idea that President Obama embraced, Majority Leader Cantor embraced, Steve Case, a great friend of mine who's on the President's Job Council, he and I had been working on this issue along with a senator from Kansas, Jerry Moran, Pat Toomey and others for some time. And I'm proud to say that I think it was last week it was signed into law, the so-called Jobs Act, which does basically raise the requirements before you have to qualify for SEC filings, allows startup companies to go in a more confidential basis at first to the SEC to kind of test out whether they want to still go through appropriate public review before they go public, but again, giving that option more viability, changing what's called Sarbanes-Oxley 404, so there's more of an on-ramp for smaller companies to go public without all the full, triplicate level oversight reviews that were required by Sarbanes-Oxley. Did we get it perfect? No. Matter of fact, some of the things, we put $1 billion, for example, market cap before you had to qualify. I think we could have gotten by with a lower market cap, but net, there is some good securities reform in this piece of legislation. At the same time, there was a source of this legislation on crowdfunding that says, how do we take the first steps in allowing certain registered sites to be, in effect, aggregators of capital, become that trusted site where consumers can, with small amounts of capital, I can't remember, we capped it at $5 grand or 10 grand, but very small amounts of capital, invest in startup companies. One of the challenges was to make sure we didn't turn this into the kind of telephone bucket shops that would prey upon unsophisticated investors that we all heard about in the 90s. I think the power of the internet, the power of the ability to police, the knowledge that will be able to come about by those who will take advantage of the bad actors. We, again, probably didn't get it perfect, but I'm much more sanguine about the ability for the internet, just as they did with trading through eBay, to get crowdfunding right with a vigilant group of consumers and consumer advocates around this space, and at the same time open up a whole new avenue of fundraising to entrepreneurial companies. So that the Jobs Act's relative passage, and a passage even in a presidential year, is the good. The bad, or the kind of not so good, is another piece of the legislation that Senator Moran and I have been working on under this so-called Startup Act. One problem, obviously, for entrepreneurial companies is raising capital. Another problem is raising talent. We all know, I think all of us in this room would agree, that we all live in a global economy, and the competition for talent is a global competition. What we are blessed with in America is, with all our challenges, still the world's finest colleges and universities. Unfortunately, particularly as we get into the graduate fields, particularly graduate fields in STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, we too often train the world's best and brightest and then send them home. So our Startup Act included a new category of visas called for STEM visas, graduate degrees, so that we can allow those bright electrical engineers and computer scientists, if they get a graduate degree, no matter where they come from, to keep that job here in America rather than sending them home. We create a new entrepreneur class of visas so that if somebody has an H-1B visa, then wants to go into starting a business, if they can raise a couple $100,000 of capital and hire 3 to 5 Americans, we're going to give them a path to start that business here in America. The good news is the business community supports this, and most entrepreneurs, tech community supports this. We still have a challenge getting it through Congress because there are some folks who are just anti-immigrant under any course. There are some that are progressive on immigration but believe that the only way we should do this is if we do comprehensive immigration reform. I favor comprehensive immigration reform, but in the meantime, I do believe we need to move forward on the STEM field. So still work to be done on the startup area. Another component of the Startup Act is one, and this will have some trepidation at universities like UVA. We actually believe that we ought to take a small percentage of federal research, about 0.15%, not a large amount, but use those dollars to spur research out of the classroom, out of the laboratory, into applied research. I think there's a lot of great R&D being done at universities around the country, but I still think too many universities put too many roadblocks between getting that research out of the laboratory into the marketplace. So we definitely want to stir the pot a little bit on applied research. Last point I want to make, and then I'd love to take questions as time allows, and that is that, as optimistic as I am about America's recovery, as optimistic as I am with all the challenges we face about America's long-term economic prospects, the single biggest overhang we have in this country is not lack of innovation, not lack of good people, not lack of good ideas, But the single biggest thing I think we face from a governmental standpoint is this almost $16 trillion debt overhang. A debt that every day that we fail to act upon, we add $4.5 billion a day to the debt. If you take away none of the other data that I give you today, and I know I'm a little bit of a data freak, take away this. Right now, federal government spending is at 25% of our GDP. That is an all-time high. Tax revenues, federal tax revenues are at 15% of our GDP. That is a 70-year low. The delta, basically, we borrow, disproportionately we borrow from China. The only time in the last 70 years we've had a budget balance or surplus, sometime under Clinton, sometime under Nixon, was when spending and revenues were roughly at 20%. So if we are going to get a real balanced budget approach in place, we're going to have to both decrease spending, and that means not just discretionary spending, it means entitlement spending, it means defense, and it means we're going to have to raise revenues. And I, for one, believe that is my sole #1 job here. As was mentioned earlier, it's the only way it's going to happen is a bipartisan effort. We do have this so-called gang of 6, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. We got up to 45 senators supporting it, 100 House members. We are going to have to do something at the end of the year when all the tax breaks and other things work out. I would ask of all of you, regardless of your political affiliation, even if you hate politics, you've got to demand of us that we get this fixed, because nothing could be more devastating to our economy than to go through the same kind of embarrassing chaos that we went through in July of 2011 and have the tax cuts all expire, have all the sequester cuts come in place, and have us look as embarrassed as we did before. That could cause an interest rate spike, particularly considering what's going on in Europe. And nothing would be more devastating to start up businesses than 400, 500 basis point interest rate spike at this point. So keep our feet to the fire in getting this done. So with that as an overly long introduction, and I know my staff is freaking out here on the side. They say I've got to move on, but being the boss, I get to ignore them for a while. But depending on your time and interest, I'd be more than happy to take a question or two. Thank you all very much. Question, comments, suggestions, criticisms?
We can't hear it all.
You can't. I can't hear you. Does that mean everybody's happy with everything going on in Washington?
No, I think we're going to have some people come up to the microphones. I'll repeat the questions just so that folks can hear. While we're waiting for folks to come down, one I'd like to ask is, I know we're doing actually pretty well in terms of the knowledge economy. What are your thoughts in terms of bringing more manufacturing jobs back into the U.S.?
Manufacturing numbers have actually increased fairly dramatically. Of course, as we all know, with numbers, you can make them look whatever way you want. The decline in manufacturing was so precipitous since 2007, 2008, and early 2009. The fact that we've seen dramatic bump ups now doesn't get us back up to pre-2007 numbers. Here's the challenge and the opportunity. The opportunity is net in manufacturing and total GDP, we're higher than we were in 2007. That's good news. Bad news is it doesn't mean the jobs have replaced. We have seen continuing increases in productivity, particularly in manufacturing, that has allowed us to increase our manufacturing productivity without jobs. How do we deal with this both on how do we get at this on a more productive basis? 3 ideas. One is, and this was something I started when I was governor, and unfortunately the subsequent governors didn't carry it on. In manufacturing, you've got to have skills beyond high school. You may not need a college degree, though. I know this is heresy to say at UVA, but you need high school plus. So what we put in place was a requirement that said if you are going to graduate from high school and you don't intend to go on to college, we'll guarantee you not only a high school diploma, but also an industry certification, oftentimes a manufacturing industry certification, and we'll give you up to a free semester at the community college to make sure you get that industry certification. You raise the earning power of anybody by about $4 an hour. You take our system and stretch it to a K-12 and a half, which is not as good as the Germans, which is a K-13 apprenticeship program. There's a lot we can learn from the Germans in terms of advanced manufacturing, but having those skills in place is one good step in the right direction, number one. Number two, with the increasing prices of transport of manufactured goods and increasing price rises in China, more and more opportunity exists for us to insource manufacturing jobs back into this country, particularly into rural communities. We started that in Virginia in areas on the tech side with companies like CGI out in Russell County and Lebanon, but I think we need more incentives to try to bring back jobs in the manufacturing area, mid-level manufacturing jobs back into this country. And third, finally, and this is something that we can do with a relatively low investment at a national level. You know, the United States of America is the only country that has no formal economic development effort. I can assure you states and local governments do. When we were competing, when I was governor and I'm competing against Illinois or North Carolina or New York, Virginia could win almost every time. When I was competing as governor against South Korea or China or Mexico, where those communities could actually add federal government incentives as well, it was a tougher act. So what we've proposed is at least an experimental program, and I've partnered with Congressman Frank Wolf out of Northern Virginia, a Republican member. We've got a bill called America Recruits that would add on top of state and local economic development efforts up to $5,000 in forgivable loans per advanced manufacturing job if you could demonstrate that that job was being insourced back into America. That $5,000 alone is not going to deliver the job. You're still going to have an attractive state and local economic development product, but you know, it would be a step in the right direction and a tool we ought to use to at least get the federal government in helping a little bit state and localities and bringing some of those jobs back into this country. I'll take two more questions. I know my staff is giving me the evil eye here, because I'm supposed to go into another meeting. But another question or two?
Can I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Anybody else?
Excuse me?
Yeah, we've got one. I'll repeat it as soon as the question is asked.
Senator Warner, I think you correctly stated that the deficit issue is ultimately the biggest economic issue facing the country. My question to you is, in a political year, how do we get a national consensus that we need to deal with this? And second, related, is there something we can do at the grassroots level to help that process?
Yes. Well, let me, first thing, I didn't get the memo when I ran for this job that said we got to take presidential election years off. You know, it's insane what we're doing right now. You know, China's not taking 2012 off. Brazil's not taking 2012 off. Our competitors are not. The idea that we're caught in this political, limbo land is insane. In the past, America had such an advantage over every other nation that if we screwed up for a while, it didn't matter. We still have advantages, but we don't have that kind of qualitative lead. So what I'm doing is going to the business community, business leader by business leader, because a lot of the major business organizations back in 2011 took a pass. And I'm saying, Simpson Bowles Gang of Six may not be the perfect plan, but it was roughly what a lot of people have endorsed: $2 in cuts for every $1 in additional revenues, raises revenues not through raising tax rates, but actually by eliminating tax expenditures, goes ahead and takes on some of the entitlement issues, both Medicare and Social Security, which, by the way, when I was a kid, 16 workers per retiree, now there are only 3. It's not anybody's fault other than the fact that we're all living too long, and we've got to find ways to make it sustainable. What you can do, and you have to do this, is you have to demand better action from all of us or fire us all. No excuses. And if those of you in the crowd who are Republicans, go find a Democrat who's willing to tell the truth about entitlements and support them. For those of you in the crowd who are Democrats, go find a Republican who's willing to be supportive of increased revenues and support them. Unless we get out of our own personal foxholes and reinforce good behavior by guys who, in both parties, to do the right thing, we're screwed. That's a political term, technical political term. But there is no reinforcing mechanism in this town for people to do the right thing. Instead, we've got the forces of the status quo, labor organizations, AARP, who zap any Democrat who wants to do entitlements. You've got these conservative foundations and Grover Norquist who zap anybody who wants to do more revenues. You cannot solve this problem on one side of the balance sheet alone. You know, one last point on this, and I know they're giving you the hook, but this is one of my biggest concerns, for example, with Paul Ryan's budget. I have a lot of intellectual admiration for Paul Ryan, and some of the things he's done around entitlements, you know, are worthy of fair debate. But what Mr. Ryan does that we have to be careful about with these budgets that sound too simplistic is we in the federal government only spend 14%, 14 cents on every dollar that we spend on education, on infrastructure from roads, highways, roads and bridges, ports, on research and development, on energy, on early childhood, all the kind of things that you would do to help grow your economy for the 21st century. He takes that 14 cents and takes it down to 5%. You know, you can't compete if you spend less than 5% of your GDP on educating your workforce, creating intellectual capital, building an infrastructure. Heck, the Europeans alone spend more than 5% just on their infrastructure. So, you know, you've got to demand better of us, and if we don't do it, fire us.
We won't fire you, Senator.
Senator, I think we're good. We really appreciate your generosity with your time, and thank you very, very much.
The best thing you all can do is make sure you get me 15 new startup companies that Columbia Capital or other regional venture capitalists can help fund, go create a lot of jobs. God bless, go at it. Thank you all.